On New Year's Eve in 2018, Army Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III stepped away from a family party to bring his wife some food and never made it back. Instead, in the driveway of his own family home, Tyrone was ambushed and shot multiple times in a calculated execution that would later reveal something devastating. This wasn't a random act of violence, and it wasn't about chance. It was a murder planned in secret, fueled by an affair, greed, and the people Tyrone trusted the most. Today, we're going to talk about how a devoted soldier, husband, and father was lured into his final moments and how the truth behind his murder slowly unraveled. Welcome to True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell before you go. All right, my friends, let's get into today's case, starting with some background on all the parties involved. Tyrone Hassel III was born on August 23, 1995 in Michigan, and his family, friends, and community said that he was a kind, ambitious young man with a bright future ahead of him. From the very beginning, Tyrone had a deep desire to do better than the environment that he grew up in. His father, Tyrone Hassel Jr., talks about his son's drive and motivation and said that his son decided to enlist in the U.S. Army while he was in college. He saw military service as a meaningful way to build a stable, purposeful future and a way to escape what he saw as the limited opportunities that surrounded him in Southwest Michigan. In his Army career, Tyrone was a committed and dependable soldier. He was a sergeant working as a wheel vehicle mechanic at Fort Stewart in Georgia, and everyone that served with him remembered him as someone who took all of his job responsibilities seriously, both at work and in his role as a leader among his peers. His decision to enlist in 2015 marked the beginning of a new life defined by service, discipline, and brotherhood. But Tyrone was so much more than a soldier. He was a family man at heart, and in 2015, while stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado, Tyrone met his future wife, Kamiya. Their relationship progressed quickly, and they got married and welcomed a son named Tyrone IV. Family members said that he showed the same loyalty and warmth at home as he did in his military career. In family photos, Tyrone is always seen smiling next to his father or with his little son on his hip, and this just shows you what a proud father and devoted son that he was. Friends and relatives also described Tyrone as easygoing and generous, and someone who made people feel seen and appreciated. His father said that his son truly loved his wife and family, and that he carried himself with a sense of pride in everything that he did, whether that was finishing a tough day on base or spending quiet evenings with his wife and his little son. On base, soldiers looked up to him, and his peers really respected his work ethic. Even during leave and time off, he was someone who, if you asked him about his holiday plans or his hobbies, would then shift the conversation back to how he could serve others first. His upbringing by a family that valued hard work and integrity really laid the foundation for the kind of life that Tyrone was working so hard to build. When he came home on leave to Michigan in 2018 to spend holidays with his family and his son, nobody could have known that his life was going to be tragically cut short and that this would be the last holiday season that they would be spending with Tyrone. Now, to get to know his wife a little bit, Kamiya Hassel was a young Army specialist who married Tyrone and shared the life of a military family with him. In her early 20s, Kamiya was stationed with Tyrone at Fort Stewart, where she worked as an Army truck driver. Initially, Kamiya fit in pretty well with the Hassel family, and Tyrone's relatives, including his mom and stepmom, had a great relationship with her. They treated Kamiya like one of their own. She lived with Tyrone in Colorado during his Fort Carson assignment and later in Georgia, and she was the mother of Tyrone's only child. Kamiya's life seemed picture perfect as a young military wife with a beautiful baby boy and a loving husband who they were all working together to build their career in the Army. Beneath the surface, however, Kamiya led a double life, and she was hiding it well. At some point during her service, Kamiya began an affair with another soldier named Specialist Jeremy Queller, and they met while deployed overseas at Camp Casey in South Korea. This was an assignment that Tyrone was not assigned to. This secret relationship would become the catalyst for what happened in today's case. People that knew Kamiya were shocked to learn what she was capable of and the level of deceit and violence because she had a good relationship with the family, and there were no signs of this dark secret that she was harboring. Now we're going to learn a little bit more about Kamiya's affair partner. Jeremy Queller was a specialist in the U.S. Army who crossed paths with the Hassels through the tight-knit world of military life. Queller served as a truck driver at Fort Stewart, so the same base as the Hassels, and he had the same job as Kamiya. Jeremy was described as friendly and personable, but he was also okay with breaking military code or bro code, as some would put it, in pursuit of his own desires. Despite knowing that Kamiya was Tyrone's wife, to their friends on base, Jeremy would refer to Kamiya as his girl. Keep in mind, he's saying this to their coworkers, even though she's clearly married. Even worse than calling Tyrone his girl, he also said, quote, Sergeant Hassel has to go, unquote, referring to Tyrone. Off base, Jeremy was a father himself. He had a young daughter from a prior relationship, and people described him as this soft spoken and polite guy. This made it even more disturbing when evidence later revealed how deeply he was involved with what happened in today's story. Together, Kamiya Hassel and Jeremy Queller formed a lethal relationship. They were both young soldiers entangled in a love affair, and both saw Tyrone not as Kamiya's loving husband or the father of her child, but as an obstacle that they needed to remove. So, now that you kind of know who everybody is, we're going to talk about the events that led up to today's case. By late 2018, when Tyrone and Kamiya were stationed at Fort Stewart, the cracks in their marriage were pretty invisible to outsiders, but even worse behind closed doors. Kamiya's affair with Jeremy had intensified, and the two communicated secretly using Snapchat. They would talk about their relationship, and eventually they made a plan to get rid of Tyrone. They knew that if Tyrone was out of the picture, that they could be together out in the open. Another factor here, though, was money. Kamiya would benefit financially from Tyrone's death because, as his spouse, she was the beneficiary of his military life insurance policy, which was worth $400,000. But money wasn't the only motive here. Kamiya wasn't happy with her marriage for other reasons as well, but apparently divorce wasn't an option. Tyrone was a devoted husband, but he also had strong family ties. At the time, he was arranging for his little sister to come live with them in Georgia to help her get on her feet. This plan irritated Kamiya. She, quote, didn't want that to happen, end quote, because a different family member, who was Tyrone's brother, had lived with them before, and it caused a lot of fights between everybody. I can't help but wonder if maybe this is because she was emotionally detaching from her husband and his family, but let me know your thoughts on this in the comments down below. Kamiya shared her frustrations with Jeremy about sharing her home and life with Tyrone's relatives. In her mind, eliminating Tyrone would free her from these obligations and the inconveniences. Because of the affair, money, and unhappiness, by December 2018, Kamiya and Jeremy decided that they would kill Tyrone Hassel III. Every year, many Army units have a block leave around the holidays so that soldiers can go back home and spend time with their families. Tyrone and Kamiya planned to visit Tyrone's family in Michigan over Christmas and New Year's, and Jeremy was also planning to be on leave around that same time. The two of them saw this as their chance. Away from the structured environment on base and in a quiet Michigan town, they believed that they could carry out the murder during the holiday festivities. Jeremy Queller made the 12-hour drive from Georgia to Michigan in mid-December 2018. Phone records show that between December 19th and December 31st, Jeremy traveled near the Hassel family home on 4 separate occasions. I find that so disturbing because he had so many opportunities to make the right choice in this case. Each trip, Kamiya and Jeremy tried to arrange the perfect moment to ambush Tyrone. But again and again, their attempts were blocked by unforeseen circumstances. Tyrone was usually surrounded by family and friends during that time, or the timing just didn't line up. On one occasion, the two were planning to carry out the murder over Snapchat while Jeremy was nearby, but they didn't go through with it. These reoccurring delays frustrated Kamiya. With every failed attempt, her urgency grew, and they were running out of time because the holiday leave was almost over, and both Kamiya and Tyrone were due to report back to Fort Stewart on January 2nd, 2019. New Year's Eve 2018 had arrived, and Kamiya felt like this was her last opportunity. Earlier that day, Tyrone and Kamiya spent time with the family in St. Joseph Township, Michigan, where Tyrone's father lived. Tyrone planned to ring in the new year at a family gathering that night. At some point that day, he made a trip to Walmart to buy ammunition, and conflicting reports say that this was likely for celebratory gunfire or just to have on hand while visiting. I found out that in some communities, it's a tradition to fire shots into the air at midnight, but this is very dangerous, and I actually have taken care of someone in the hospital that had done this for celebration, so please be careful if this is an activity you participate in, or just don't do it at all. Kamiya knew about this errand and later told investigators she actually thought Jeremy might try to kill Tyrone during that Walmart trip. She thought that maybe Jeremy would stage a robbery or a drive-by shooting in the parking lot. However, Tyrone did not go alone. Someone went with him on the shopping trip, so Jeremy decided that this wasn't the right time. When Tyrone returned safely from Walmart, Kamiya was angry. According to her confession, she confronted Jeremy about him backing out and asked why he hadn't taken the opportunity. Jeremy explained that Tyrone wasn't alone and he didn't want to attempt the hit with a witness there. This excuse did not satisfy Kamiya, though. She said that it almost seemed like Jeremy didn't want to carry out the murder at all, which made her angry. Kamiya then gave him an ultimatum. Jeremy had to kill Tyrone that night on New Year's Eve or not at all, and she gave him two reasons why. First, she didn't want Tyrone to return with her to George on II because this was the end of the line for their relationship. Second, she wouldn't get another convenient chance because family gatherings and the holiday chaos provided a cover story that wouldn't exist once they were back on base. Kamiya added that Tyrone's plan to have his sister move in with them was set, and this was something that Kamiya was desperately trying to avoid. Kamiya made it clear that for their plan to be fulfilled, Tyrone needed to be dead before the clock struck 12. Faced with Kamiya's pressure, Jeremy agreed that the murder would happen that night, and the pair fine-tuned their plan for that evening. Kamiya would help lure Tyrone into an ambush attack, and Jeremy would be the trigger man. They chose Tyrone's father's house off of Colfax Avenue and the window of time when Tyrone would be the most vulnerable, which is when he would step away from the New Year's Eve party. Then Kamiya would deceptively ask Tyrone to come home from the party to bring her some food. It was a simple request that any wife might make, and Tyrone, being the devoted husband that he was, would of course agree to this. As darkness fell on December 31st, 2018, Tyrone Hassel III was enjoying time with his family at the New Year's Eve party, which was just a few blocks away from his dad's house. The house on Colfax Avenue where Tyrone, Kamiya, and their one-year-old son were staying during that leave was just a short walking distance away from that party. Sometime around 10:40 p.m., Tyrone got a text message from Kamiya. She mentioned that she hadn't eaten that much that day, and she asked if he could bring over a plate of food from the party for her. Tyrone was known to be attentive and caring, and she knew that he would happily bring her over some food just as she planned. Unbeknownst to Tyrone, this innocent errand was exactly what Kamiya and Jeremy had plotted. Sadly, everything was now in place for the ambush. Earlier that evening, Jeremy Queller drove his black Chevy Impala to an area near the Hassel residence. He chose a dark, vacant house at 2054 Gerald Street, which is directly behind the backyard of Tyrone's dad's property. Jeremy parked the Impala in the abandoned driveway, backing in so that he could make a quick getaway later. A neighbor later reported noticing this suspicious vehicle. They had a dark-colored sedan with distinctive LED headlights and parked oddly in the empty home's driveway. The car arrived once at around 9:30 p.m., left, and then returned again about 10 minutes later, which is clearly not typical behavior in this quiet neighborhood. After parking the second time, he stepped out of the driver's seat dressed in dark clothes and walked down Gerald Street toward Delaware Street, which would lead him to the back of the Hassel property. He was armed and ready, stalking through the shadows, and he took position behind a shed on the property line, which provided cover and a vantage point of the driveway off of Colfax where Tyrone's truck was parked. There, Jeremy waited in the cold for his now or never moment. Inside the house on Colfax, Kamiya was anxiously passing the time while she was alone with the baby and was constantly glancing at her phone for updates from Jeremy. She knew what was supposed to happen next, and yet she needed to act as though nothing were off. Around 11 p.m., Tyrone Hassel III pulled up with his black Dodge pickup truck with a plate of food for Kamiya. He was only inside for about 2 or 3 minutes, according to Kamiya, and Tyrone mentioned that he was just going to go head back to the New Year's Eve party off of Lincoln Avenue to continue celebrating with his family, and Kamiya said that Tyrone was alone, just like she planned, but he left the truck running outside so he could get back there quickly. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary to Tyrone in those final moments. At about 11:03 p.m., Tyrone stepped outside of the front door into the cold night to return back to the party. He had no way of knowing that there was a gunman prowling just a few yards away in the darkness. The street was dimly lit and the neighborhood was quiet because most residents were indoors waiting for the new year. As Tyrone walked towards his truck, Jeremy Queller made his move. From behind the cover of the side yard, Jeremy emerged and raised his gun. Without warning, he opened fire on the unsuspecting soldier at close range. The explosion of gunfire shattered the holiday silence when 6 loud shots rang out in rapid succession. Bullet after bullet hit Tyrone before he could even react or seek cover. He was struck multiple times, and this left him critically wounded and bleeding on the ground. The ferocity of the attack shows how Jeremy's plan was to make sure that Tyrone had no chance of survival. Jeremy then stood over him and shot him in the forehead while Tyrone was laying on the ground. Inside the house, Kamiya Hassel heard the gunfire just outside the door, but she did hear the sound of all the gunfire right after her husband walked outside. Kamiya ran, but not to help her husband. She grabbed their toddler and hid in a back bedroom, waiting until the shooting stopped. This may have been to shield her child, or it was just a calculated move to make sure that she wasn't near any windows while Jeremy was firing off. When the shots stopped, Kamiya came outside to see what happened. Tyrone was laying on the ground by the corner of his truck. He was bleeding profusely and unresponsive. The plate of food that he had brought was still inside, warm and untouched as his final act of kindness. Kamiya ran to be by her husband's side, later telling police that she hugged him and tried to wake him up but got no response. In reality, Tyrone was gravely wounded, but miraculously, he still had a faint pulse. Tyrone was clinging to life in those final moments after the attack. Jeremy ran immediately, and neighbors who heard the gunfire looked out to see what was happening, and one witness caught a glimpse of a man that was 5'9" with a medium build, dressed in dark clothing, running away and jumping into a dark sedan that was parked off of Gerald Street. The car's engine revved and it roared off into the night, heading north towards the main road. The entire attack took just seconds, and by the time the neighbors realized what was happening, the killer was already gone. At 11:04 p.m., just moments after the shots, Kamiya called 911 in a panic. On the recorded call, she sounded frantic and distraught as she reported that her husband had been shot outside of their home. She yelled, "Someone shot my husband," and begged for them to send an ambulance. St. Joseph Township police officers were dispatched at 11:10 p.m. and arrived within minutes to the address on Colfax Avenue. They found a chaotic, heartbreaking scene with Kamiya on the ground next to Tyrone, and he was sprawled out between the house and the pickup truck. Despite sustaining catastrophic injuries, Tyrone was somehow still alive at that point. He was breathing, but barely. Kamiya appeared to be a hysterical wife, desperately clinging to her husband, and body camera footage from the police officers actually show Kamiya grabbing onto his body, sobbing and unwilling to let go of him. One of the officers said that as they loaded Tyrone onto a gurney to rush him to the hospital, Kamiya was so overcome with grief that she tried to climb into the ambulance with him. It took the responding officers by surprise because at that moment, it truly seemed like she was in genuine shock and suffering over her husband's shooting. Tyrone was rushed to Spectrum Lakeland Hospital in St. Joseph, which was their closest trauma center nearby. Medics fought hard to keep him alive during this ride, but his injuries were devastating. The bullets that struck Tyrone's head and neck caused severe damage, and he lost a lot of blood, which, as always, we will get into here shortly. Despite the doctor's best efforts, Tyrone Hassel III was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. It was still New Year's Eve when Tyrone succumbed to his injuries, meaning he would never see the first day of 2019, and he was just 23 years old. Back at the scene, Kamiya's performance as the grief-stricken wife continued. When officers briefly interviewed her that night, she told them that Tyrone was bringing her some food from a party, and when he left, the gunshots just erupted. She insisted she had no idea who could have done this or why, because Tyrone was a family man and had no enemies, and their marriage was good and happy. Kamiya portrayed herself as this loving spouse in shock, suggesting that a random assailant must have attacked Tyrone. There was no hint in her words at all that she knew the truth. In fact, officers on scene found her so distraught and credible that they had no immediate reason to suspect her. Tyrone's father said that for nearly 2 weeks after the murder, they catered to Kamiya with sympathy, completely unaware that she was the orchestrator of this whole tragedy. With Tyrone back at the hospital and backup units arriving to the scene, police began to secure and process the crime scene off of Colfax Avenue. The area was taped off, and detectives and evidence technicians worked well into the early hours of New Year's Day. Despite the emotional distraction of Kamiya's grief, investigators treated the scene as a typical homicide investigation. They methodically documented everything in the driveway and yard and surrounding areas that might shed some more light on this shooting. However, even on that first night, clues pointing to the truth were already present in the physical evidence that was left behind. The investigators collected 5 spent shell casings, which were found scattered near the driveway and front yard, and this lined up with the number of shots that the neighbors had heard. A spent bullet was also found on scene. The investigators traced the bullet's pathway, and they found one bullet hole in the wooden fence around the property and another bullet hole in the garage door of Tyrone's father's house. This means that not every round hit Tyrone because some missed or passed through him, lodging into some nearby structures. The angles of these bullet holes were documented to help them reconstruct the shooter's position, though. Given the darkness outside and the shooter fleeing, officers brought in police canine units to track the suspect's scent. Starting from the spot where Tyrone fell by his truck, Canine Officer Max picked up a scent leading away from the victim's vehicle through the backyard. The dog led officers behind two sheds just north of the house, then across Delaware Street to Gerald Street, which traced the possible escape route of the perpetrator. The trail went cold near Gerald Street, just south of where it crossed Hunter Avenue, and this is consistent with the suspect getting into a vehicle at that point. This is the same spot that the neighbor saw that suspicious car. At the start of the canine's track behind a shed off of Colfax Avenue, investigators discovered a fresh boot print in the dirt, and the print being there corroborated the fact that someone had in fact been there, so photos and casts were made of the print for later evidence. Officers canvassed nearby homes for anyone who saw or heard anything unusual, and one neighbor's statement was especially interesting to the police. He described a dark sedan parked at the vacant house off of Gerald Street that night. He said that it was a black or dark colored car and that it looked like a newer model with a row of LED lights across the front. The neighbor noticed the car arrive and leave twice, and on the second time, he saw the man exit the driver's side and walk towards the Hassel residence just before 10:45 p.m. He also mentioned that right after the gunshots, he looked out again and the car was gone. The same vehicle had been seen at the vacant property a few nights earlier as well, meaning someone could have been staking out the Hassel home leading up to the murder. This witness information gave police an early idea that the shooting was probably not done at random. While police officers did their initial sweep, though, Kamiya Hassel was taken to the police station to give her initial statement that night, and she reiterated what she'd already said on scene. Detectives asked if Tyrone had any enemies or if she could think of anybody that would want to harm him. Kamiya said that she had no idea who would target her husband, emphasizing that he was a good man and they had a happy life and no issues. She even volunteered information about Tyrone's life insurance, unprompted, mind you, and mentioned that the Army's policy would pay her $400,000 because of his death. My friends, this is what we like to call a Freudian slip. This struck investigators as a bit odd that she brought up the life insurance money while freshly grieving, but it was not a smoking gun on its own. At that point, Kamiya was treated as just a cooperative witness because, after all, she was a soldier too and the victim's spouse. So the assumption was that she was suffering an immense and terrible loss, not orchestrating it. The initial theory among law enforcement was that Tyrone's killing might be a case of a targeted shooting, possibly related to his military service or some unknown personal issue. Even though they had their theories, though, leads were scarce at the beginning. The forensic evidence pointed to a perpetrator who came prepared and left quickly, so it could have been someone who knew Tyrone's personal schedule. The witness's description of the suspicious car and mystery man on Gerald Street was a huge clue, but by itself, it didn't identify any suspects. As days passed in early January 2019, detectives worked around the clock to analyze the evidence. The shell casings and bullet were sent to a ballistics lab for analysis, and the caliber was found to be a 9mm handgun based off of the ammo found on scene. They had their boot print cast, but they had no one to compare the boot to. Police also reviewed surveillance cameras in the area, and they found something interesting. A state of Michigan license plate reader off of the highway captured an image of a Georgia license plate registered to Jeremy Queller's Chevy Impala. They found this less than 3 hours before the murder, and this was huge. It placed a specific out-of-state vehicle near the scene the very night of the crime, and one that matched the neighbor's description. However, in the first week after the murder, Jeremy Queller's name wasn't fully on the investigators' radar yet. The plate reader data was a puzzle piece, but it needed more context to it. Before we get into that, though, we need to talk about the autopsy findings. The autopsy of Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III was conducted on January 2, 2019. Dr. Joyce DeJong, who was the chief medical examiner at the time, oversaw his autopsy, and this is an extensive report, so I'm going to break down a little bit of it for you, as always. Tyrone suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head, and one of these was particularly severe. A bullet struck him directly in the forehead, entering the skull from the front, and this caused catastrophic damage to his brain tissue. The trajectory suggested that it was fired from very close range while Tyrone was likely laying down on the ground. There was also extensive fracturing to the skull and lacerations or tears of the brain tissue associated with that specific shot, and this is consistent with a contact or near contact gunshot wound to the forehead. The second head wound's exact placement isn't explicitly described in the report summary, but given that 2 headshots were mentioned, it could have been on the side or back of Tyrone's head. What was made clear, though, was that either of these head wounds alone could be life-threatening, so together they made survival nearly impossible. The brain injuries would have caused instant unconsciousness, which we know was true for Tyrone, but he did still have a faint pulse. He was strong and clearly a fighter in this scenario. Another bullet struck Tyrone in the neck, and the autopsy mentioned a gunshot entry wound on the right side of the neck, and this traveled through vital structures. The path nicked the carotid artery, and it potentially injured his cervical spine as well. Kamiya later said that Jeremy first shot Tyrone in the head, and then Jeremy realized that Tyrone was very much so still breathing. The neck wound would have caused massive internal bleeding and possibly paralysis of the spinal cord since it was hit, but either way, hitting any major blood vessel, even by just grazing it, is typically lethal. A fourth gunshot hit Tyrone in the upper body, specifically in the left shoulder region near his scapula. We know that the subclavian vessels run near the shoulder, which we covered at length in the Selena video, but compared to the head and neck wounds, a shoulder wound is more survivable on its own. However, this was only one of multiple shots that he sustained. During the autopsy, the medical examiner also performed an x-ray to determine the wound tracks and locate any bullets or fragments that were still inside of Tyrone's body. One bullet was recovered during the autopsy. This means that 3 of the shots passed through Tyrone and exit wounds were present, but one bullet remained lodged internally, and the recovered projectile was preserved as evidence and later analyzed by the ballistic experts as well. The cause of death determined by autopsy was multiple gunshot wounds, with the most critical injuries being to the head and neck. The autopsy findings align perfectly with that story that was unfolding from witness accounts and evidence. The cluster of wounds in vital areas showed intent to kill, not stray bullets from a warning shot or struggle. Upon hearing the autopsy results, Tyrone's family was overcome with anguish at the thought of what their son had endured. His father later said that imagining how his son was betrayed and slaughtered made it very difficult to have any sympathy for Kamiya anymore, which is more than understandable. Now to go back to the investigation. For about 11 days, Tyrone's murder was unsolved. The community was on edge and Tyrone's family was grieving, not only mourning him, but also processing the fear that a killer was still on the loose. Police had kept details of the case under wraps, but it was clear that they were investigating aggressively. Kamiya, during this time, played the role of the devastated widow convincingly. Tyrone's funeral was scheduled for January 12, 2019, and Kamiya was treated kindly by the whole family who had no inkling whatsoever of what she had done. The breakthrough came on January 11th, so just one day before the funeral. That morning at 11 a.m., St. Joseph Township Police received an anonymous phone call that would turn the entire case upside down. A woman called in and said that her son was in the Army, and he told her that Kamiya Hassel was involved in a relationship with a fellow soldier and that this relationship might be connected to Tyrone's murder. She said that the affair could have led to something like this, implying that Kamiya and her lover plotted this murder. This was a bombshell for the investigators, so their focus quickly shifted to the grieving widow that could actually be involved. The detectives validated this tip, and it turned out that the Army community at Fort Stewart had already started sharing concerns that Kamiya and Jeremy were behind this. In fact, on that very same day, 2 of Jeremy's fellow soldiers approached the Army's Criminal Investigators Division, or CID, at Fort Stewart to report their fears about him. Jaquan Hamilton and another friend of Queller's told CID agents that Jeremy had been acting strangely and that they knew he'd been dating Kamiya. Hamilton specifically remembered how Jeremy told him about Kamiya and said that Tyrone had to go. These soldiers were so disturbed that Hamilton said he was starting to feel anxious about his own safety and was worried that Jeremy might harm him for knowing too much. One friend even said that Jeremy Queller had bragged about the murder, and he said that after shooting Sergeant Hassel, he noticed that Tyrone was still alive, so he fired again directly into Tyrone's forehead to finish the job. The CID also learned that Jeremy had recently bought some firearms. An Army special agent named Zachary Roberts discovered that Jeremy purchased 2 guns from another soldier named Sergeant Golston not long before the murder. One of those guns was a 9mm, which matched the caliber used to kill Tyrone. The Army CID and Michigan police worked together, and Michigan detectives were shocked at how fast this case was falling into place. They had suspected that the crime was targeted, but now they had names and a motive. That same day, January 11th, investigators in Berrien County called in Kamiya Hassel for another round of questioning, but this time they were far more confrontational. Kamiya arrived at the police station on January 11th completely unaware that suspicion had then shifted towards her. Detectives began the interview in a very lighthearted way, but then they confronted Kamiya with what they'd learned. They said, "We know about your relationship with Jeremy Queller." At first, Kamiya denied everything and she insisted that she was not involved with Jeremy and had absolutely nothing to do with her husband's death. But the investigators pressed her on this. They informed her that others, multiple people, had come forward and that evidence was mounting against her. Observing her demeanor and inconsistencies, the detectives decided to ask Kamiya to take a polygraph test, and hoping to prove her innocence, Kamiya agreed. Let me know if you're as surprised by this as I am. The polygraph did not go in Kamiya's favor. Shocking, I know. She failed the polygraph, with the results showing deception when she denied involvement in her husband's murder. When confronted with the results, Kamiya's facade quickly began to crumble. Faced with the accumulating evidence like the knowledge of the affair, her peers coming forward, the license plate putting Jeremy in Michigan, and now her failed test, Kamiya realized that the game was over. Later that day, Kamiya Hassel broke down and confessed her role in her husband's murder. Kamiya admitted that her and Jeremy planned the murder together while they were on leave in Michigan. She explained how Jeremy traveled to Michigan multiple times in late December, just looking for the right moment to strike. She said that a lot of their planning was done over Snapchat to avoid leaving any evidence, and Kamiya went over the events of New Year's Eve, including Jeremy parking at that vacant house on Gerald Street just to case the area, Tyrone's Walmart trip for ammo, and her frustration that Jeremy hadn't acted at that point. She confessed that she egged Jeremy on, telling him to do it that night before they returned to Georgia because of Tyrone's sister coming to live with them. She described how she informed Jeremy when Tyrone was coming back to the house for the food, setting the trap, and that when Tyrone went back outside, Jeremy would ambush and kill him. She remained cold as ice and unemotional as she talked through all these chilling details. Because of Kamiya's confession, the police wasted no time moving in on the other half of this deadly duo. They alerted authorities in Georgia to arrest specialist Jeremy Queller immediately. That same evening, law enforcement in Hinesville, Georgia, near Fort Stewart, arrived at Jeremy's residence and took him into custody. Once he was there, he declined to speak with the investigators about the case at all. Unlike Kamiya, he gave no confession at that time. Over the next few days, as Jeremy sat in the Georgia jail, officers searched Jeremy Queller's black Chevy Impala. Inside the car, they discovered boxes of 9mm ammo, a handgun magazine, and several other important pieces of evidence, but no gun. This was the same type of ammo that killed Tyrone. On January 15th, investigators also searched Jeremy's home at 710 Robin Drive in Hinesville, and in a bedroom closet, they found a Glock 23 handgun that was fully loaded. Now remember, Jeremy bought two guns from Sergeant Golston, and one of them was a Glock 23, the other was the 9mm. The presence of the 9mm ammo in the car, but the other gun at home suggested that Jeremy likely disposed of the actual murder weapon along the way back. Even though the 9mm was missing, the circumstantial evidence was still overwhelming. Ballistics experts later matched the 9mm shell casings from the scene to the brand of ammo found with Jeremy, and Golston's testimony would confirm that Jeremy had possessed a 9mm firearm of the same type that would fit those casings as well. On February 3rd, 2019, Queller was transported from Georgia to Michigan and booked into the Berrien County Jail to face charges. Both Jeremy and Kamiya were charged with first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and Jeremy faced an additional charge of felony firearm for using a gun in the crime. Sergeant Tyrone Hassel's family, in the span of just a day or two, had to grapple with knowing that Tyrone's life was not going to be able to be saved, and that his own wife was behind the murder, the woman that they'd been comforting the whole time. Tyrone's father said that he couldn't believe it and that he was livid because he sat there with Kamiya for 12 days comforting her while she was pretending to mourn. The truth was like a second devastating blow to the family, and this was right as they were laying their son to rest. Kamiya Hassel was arrested on January 12th, the very day that her husband was being buried. Instead of attending the funeral, she was in handcuffs, charged with his murder, and they were held without bond because of how violent and calculated this crime was. The investigation didn't stop at the arrest, though, because while she was in jail after her arrest, Kamiya made a call to her mother where she openly admitted to her mom for her role in the murders. That call was recorded, and it provided a powerful piece of evidence for court. Investigators also analyzed phone logs, and they discovered that Kamiya and Jeremy's phones had been in constant communication in the hours that led up to the shooting, which is just further proof how deeply they planned this together the night of the attack. When confronted with that evidence about the coordination, Kamiya's only explanation was to shift blame. She said that she never would have done something like this if it weren't for Jeremy, and that he somehow coerced or manipulated her into this whole thing. This would later become the backbone of her legal defense. After Kamiya Hassel and Jeremy Queller were arrested, Berrien County prosecutors chose to try them separately, and Kamiya went to trial first in July 2019. The trial lasted 3 days because of how overwhelming the case was against her. Prosecutors presented extensive testimony from the investigators, forensic experts, family members, and all the neighbors, along with Kamiya's own recorded confession and her jail calls. Her defense argued that she was manipulated by Jeremy, but the jury wasn't convinced. After deliberating for just over an hour, Kamiya was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder on July 18, 2019. Because Michigan law mandates life without parole for first-degree murder, she faced a guaranteed life sentence in prison at just 22 years old. Kamiya showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read. Tyrone's family expressed bittersweet relief, acknowledging that justice had been served, but that nothing was going to bring Tyrone back. At her sentencing on August 29th, the judge imposed a life sentence in prison without parole, and during the emotional victim impact statements, Tyrone's family directly confronted Kamiya, condemning her betrayal and emphasizing that she murdered her husband for financial gain. Kamiya chose not to speak or apologize to anyone, not even her own son, because she planned to appeal the case. Luckily, those appeals have not been successful. Jeremy Queller, facing the same evidence and conviction, chose to plead guilty just days before his trial. In late July 2019, he accepted a plea deal to second-degree murder, which allowed him to avoid a mandatory life sentence. On September 23, 2019, he was sentenced to 65 to 90 years in prison, meaning he will still likely die behind bars. At sentencing, Jeremy apologized to Tyrone's family and admitted his role, but he made sure to add that he had been emotionally manipulated by Kamiya. Tyrone's father later acknowledged Jeremy's remorse, but maintained that accountability mattered more than his apology did. Because both defendants were active duty soldiers at the time of the murder, the Army technically had the authority to pursue separate military charges. But Tyrone's family strongly opposed this, fearing that the death penalty could be pursued. The Army declined further prosecution because of the family's request, and both Kamiya and Jeremy were dishonorably discharged, so the case was wrapped up. Kamiya Hassel remains in prison for life without parole, and Jeremy Queller is serving a sentence that pretty much guarantees he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The murder of Tyrone Hassel III left a trail of heartbreak. Tyrone and Kamiya's son, little Tyrone IV, was just a toddler when he lost both of his parents. After Kamiya's arrest, he went to live with Kamiya's mother. Tyrone's own parents, who had already lost their son, now found themselves cut off from their grandson too. Kamiya's side of the family gained custody, and according to Tyrone's father, for a long time, the paternal grandparents were not allowing him to see their grandchild. I can't imagine how painful this was for them. They would FaceTime to try to keep a connection with him, but it was an incredibly difficult situation, with the child being raised by the family of the person responsible for his father's death. For Tyrone Jr., the priority is that his grandson knows that he was loved by his dad. Despite the painful circumstances, the Hassel family shows grace and said that they don't want any more revenge. They were even relieved that Michigan didn't have capital punishment because they feel that a lifetime of reflection in prison is more fitting justice for Kamiya rather than a quick death. This is also why Tyrone's father explicitly did not want the military to impose a death penalty for Kamiya or Jeremy, which says so much about his character as a dad and grandpa. The small town of St. Joseph Township also felt the impact because Tyrone had been a local high school football player there, and he was known in his community. Many residents attended his funeral and mourned the senseless loss, and Tyrone's family channeled their grief into preserving Tyrone's memory. Tyrone Hassel Jr. has since been active in telling his son's story, both to remember him and to warn others about the red flags that they missed with Kamiya. The family set up a scholarship fund in Tyrone's name at his old high school, and he was honored by his Army unit by being added to a Michigan memorial for fallen soldiers. The story of Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III reminds us that sometimes the gravest dangers lie closest to home, and that betrayal can be lethal. Tyrone's life, service, and the love that he had for his family will never be forgotten, and I pray that his son has a relationship with his father's side of the family someday. Thank you so much for listening to Tyrone's story today. I hope that you all enjoy this holiday season, and don't forget to set some new goals for yourself for this upcoming year. I am so So grateful to have you guys coming into this next year, and I can't wait to see where we go from here. Don't forget to drop our secret handshake, a blue butterfly in the chat, and please be sure to take good care of yourselves this week. Nurses orders. I'll see you next time. Bye.